The evening rush had already started before the sun fully disappeared behind the tall buildings. Inside the restaurant, warm yellow lights reflected off polished wooden tables, and the soft clinking of glasses blended with low conversations. It was the kind of place where people came to relax after long days, where laughter usually filled the air, and where everything felt just a little more refined in the outside world. She moved quickly between tables, balancing 2 plates on one arm and a tray of drinks in the other hand. Her steps were steady, practiced from years of doing this kind of work. Even when things got busy, she never rushed in a way that looked messy. There was a calm rhythm to how she worked, like she had learned to carry stress without letting it show. Her shift had started hours ago, and already her feet were beginning to ache. But she didn't complain. She never did. She greeted each table with the same polite smile, the same gentle tone, no matter how tired she felt. Some customers noticed her effort and thanked her. Others barely looked at her. She treated them all the same. At one corner table, a family was celebrating something special. At another, 2 men were deep in a serious business conversation. Near the window, a couple sat quietly, speaking in soft voices. The restaurant was full, but everything still felt under control, until the door opened again. The sound itself wasn't loud, but something about it made a few heads turn. A man walked in slowly, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that stood out even in a place like this. His watch caught the light as he adjusted his sleeve. There was confidence in his walk, but it wasn't the kind that made people admire him. It was the kind that made people step aside. The host greeted him with a careful smile, one that didn't feel as relaxed as before. There was recognition there. Not the kind that comes from knowing someone well, but the kind that comes from experience. The kind that says, this might not go smoothly. The man didn't return the smile. He simply looked around the restaurant as if he were judging it, taking in every detail like it needed to prove something to him. After a short pause, he pointed toward a section. I'll sit there. It wasn't a request. It was a decision. That section happened to be hers. She noticed him before the host even began walking him over. Something about the way the staff slightly shifted, the way conversations near the entrance slowed for a second. It all told her enough. She had seen customers like him before. Not exactly the same, but similar. People who didn't just come to eat. People who came expecting something more than service. Something like control. She took a quiet breath and straightened her posture before approaching the table just as he sat down. Good evening, she said gently, placing a menu in front of him. Welcome. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he adjusted his chair slightly, looked at the menu for only a second, and then looked at her. His eyes didn't carry warmth. They scanned her the way someone looks at an object, not a person. You're my server? He asked. Yes, she replied calmly. He leaned back slightly as if thinking. All right, just one word. But something in the way he said it made the moment feel heavier than it should have been. She didn't react. She had learned long ago that reacting too early only made things harder. Instead, she stood quietly, giving him time. He picked up the menu again, flipping through it without real interest. Around them, the restaurant continued as usual, but the energy near that table had shifted. A nearby couple exchanged a quick glance. One of the other servers looked over for just a second, then quickly looked away. People noticed. Even when nothing had happened yet, people noticed. After a moment, he closed the menu and placed it down. Then, without warning, he spoke again. But this time, it wasn't in English. His tone changed slightly as he began speaking in Spanish. His voice smooth, confident, and just loud enough to be heard by those close by. She didn't interrupt. She simply listened. Her expression didn't change. To anyone watching, it looked like she didn't understand. And maybe that's exactly what he expected. He continued, speaking casually, as if the language itself gave him a kind of freedom. His words flowed easily, and there was something else hidden in his tone now. Something sharper, something deliberate. At a nearby table, a man paused mid-sentence. His eyes shifted slightly, recognizing the language. A woman sitting across from him slowly lowered her glass, listening without meaning to. The air began to feel different. Still quiet, but not the comfortable kind of quiet. She stood there, holding her notepad, her posture steady. If his words affected her, it didn't show. She simply waited for him to finish, just as she would with any other customer. Inside, though, her mind was fully alert, not surprised, not confused, just aware. He finished speaking and looked at her, waiting. There was a small pause. She gave a polite nod, as if processing his order. Then she repeated it back in English, perfectly, every detail correct, every item in the right order. Her voice was calm, clear, and professional. For a brief moment, something flickered in his expression. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. Then it disappeared. He gave a short nod, as if satisfied. "Good," he said. She wrote it down, then offered a small smile. "I'll have that ready for you shortly." As she turned and walked away, the tension didn't leave with her. It stayed. The nearby tables slowly returned to their conversations, but not fully. There was a lingering awareness now, like something had started but hadn't finished. Behind the service counter, another server leaned slightly closer to her. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "Yeah, just a table." He looked past her toward the man. "That one." She didn't answer directly. She didn't need to. He sighed softly. "All right, just be careful." She gave a small, reassuring nod and picked up the tray for her next order. No hesitation. No visible stress. Just the same steady rhythm she had before. But something had shifted, not just in the room, in the story that was quietly beginning to unfold. Back at the table, the man watched the room again, his fingers lightly tapping against the table. There was a sense of patience in his posture, but also something else. Expectation. Like he was waiting for something more than just food. Like the evening for him had only just begun. And somewhere between the soft music, the low conversations, and the quiet movement of the staff, the restaurant held its breath, without even realizing it. The restaurant had settled back into its usual rhythm, but the air around that one table was different now. Conversations that had been casual moments ago had grown quieter, as if everyone nearby sensed something waiting to happen. The man in the suit sat back, arms crossed lightly, his eyes following her movements. He spoke again, this time in Spanish, his tone smoother but edged with sharpness. He began asking questions about the menu, making small jokes about the prices and portions. It wasn't the words themselves that were rude at first, just the way he said them. What kind of quiet superiority that implied he expected her to react nervously. She didn't. She smiled politely, kept her eyes calm, and wrote down his request without a word of complaint. Each step she took was careful and controlled, as though walking a delicate line between service and self-respect. Inwardly, she felt the tension build, but outwardly she showed none. Her voice remained even when she asked clarifying questions, her gestures composed as she carefully balanced the tray in her hands. Every movement was deliberate practice, but also subtly defiant. She had dealt with difficult people before, but there was something different in the way this man carried himself, like he was testing not just her, but the restaurant itself. The man's Spanish became more pointed, his words sharper now. He made comments about her intelligence, her experience, the nature of her job. To anyone who didn't understand Spanish, it might have sounded like harmless banter. But for those who understood, the barbs were clear and a few heads turned. Nearby diners froze mid-sentence, trying not to listen, but failing anyway. Whispers began to rise quietly among tables that could hear. Some people glanced at her, surprised that she hadn't flinched, that she hadn't even shown the smallest sign of being upset. She continued to take notes, writing down his orders with a calm hand. Her expression didn't change, but her mind worked quickly. Every word he spoke, she understood perfectly. Every hidden insult, every attempt to provoke, she caught immediately, but she chose silence. She knew that reacting too quickly would give him the control he wanted. Patience was her weapon, and she held it firmly, even as her heart beat a little faster in anticipation. This wasn't just a customer. This was a challenge, one she could meet without ever raising her voice. Other staff members watched from a distance, giving her small nods or quick looks of encouragement. They could see what was happening, even if the other diners didn't fully grasp it yet. The tension in the room was palpable, like a thread stretched tight. Each time he spoke in Spanish, the silence of the restaurant seemed heavier. It was a quiet kind of drama, subtle but impossible to ignore. He leaned back in his chair, speaking now with more confidence. He assumed she couldn't understand and let his words flow freely. He commented on her smile, her posture, even the way she walked between tables. There was an edge of mockery in his tone, but she continued to listen, her expression unchanging, to him. It must have seemed like she was oblivious, a blank canvas onto which he could project his superiority. But inside, she cataloged everything. Every word, every subtle inflection, every moment of pause. She stored it all, knowing that timing would be everything. Nearby, a few customers who understood Spanish exchanged glances. One young man whispered to his companion, drawing attention to what was happening. Others subtly leaned in, curious and slightly anxious. There was a growing awareness among the diners that something was unfolding that was not meant for them alone, a story within the ordinary hum of an evening meal. The man grew bolder, speaking faster now, almost like a performance. He recited jokes, half in Spanish and half in gestures, each one meant to show dominance, each one meant to test the limits of her patience. She responded with calm professionalism, taking every request in stride, writing down the orders with precision. Even when he tried to trip her up with complicated instructions, she handled them flawlessly. There was no hesitation, no stumble, no sign that his words had any power over her. He paused, a small smirk forming, thinking perhaps he had found a crack in her armor. But she did not react. She simply waited, poised and ready. Every step she took back to the kitchen was deliberate, measured. Every glance she gave was controlled, showing awareness without revealing weakness. In her silence, there was strength, a quiet authority that grew with every insult he threw her way. Other servers whispered to one another in low tones, exchanging looks of admiration and concern. They had seen this type of arrogance before, but rarely had they witnessed someone respond with such composure. It was as if she held an invisible shield around herself, one that no amount of rudeness could penetrate. The man noticed the attention now. He could sense that others were watching, though he pretended not to care. He continued his Spanish, thinking it would intimidate, thinking it would provoke. But she continued her silent strategy, collecting information, keeping track of his words and gestures, and preparing for the moment when she would respond. She knew it would come, that her chance would arrive not in haste, but in precision. Patience had its own kind of power. Every customer near the table now leaned in slightly, sensing the unspoken tension. Some were curious, some uneasy, some clearly enjoying spectacle. The restaurant staff moved cautiously, making sure service continued smoothly, while also respecting the growing attention around the table. The man's voice was steady, but the underlying challenge was clear. He wanted a reaction. He wanted control. He had not yet met anyone who could match his assumptions, anyone who could quietly stand against him without confrontation. She returned to the table with the drinks, placing them down gently. Her hands did not shake. Her smile did not falter. She confirmed the details of the order with him, speaking in English, still calm, still polite. He looked at her, and for the first time, there was a flicker in his expression, a brief moment where his confidence seemed to waver. Then he composed himself, pretending that nothing had changed. But she knew. She had seen it. She had heard it. And the diners who understood Spanish had seen it too. A subtle shift had occurred. The man's words, meant to test her patience, had landed on someone who was prepared, who had already anticipated them. The balance of power was quietly tilting, though no one outside of those few seconds could fully see it. She moved away again, heading toward the kitchen, her notepad tucked carefully under her arm. Behind her, whispers began to rise, barely audible, but they were there. Other servers exchanged glances. Customers tried to look away, but kept stealing curious glances at the interaction, sensing that something unusual was happening. It was not just a rude customer and a waitress anymore. It was a quiet battle of patience, skill, and awareness. The man returned his attention to his surroundings, trying to reassert dominance. But the quiet tension remained. He had assumed language and arrogance would give him an edge, but he had underestimated the waitress's calm and understanding. He would soon find that words are not the only way to measure strength. and respect is earned, sometimes silently, in ways that cannot be ignored. For the waitress, this was just another shift, another set of challenges. But inside, she prepared herself for what would come next. Every insult, every pointed remark, every glance, all was part of the story unfolding. And she knew that when the time came, she would respond. Not with anger, not with loud defiance, but with a quiet certainty that would shift the entire room and leave everyone, including the man who thought he held control, completely surprised. The evening continued, the restaurant humming around them, but the tension at that table remained, a quiet storm waiting to break. And in that calm, unassuming way she moved and spoke, she was already preparing to change everything. By the time the food arrived at the table, the restaurant had returned mostly to its usual rhythm. But the air near that one corner still carried a subtle tension. Diners who had been watching closely now leaned slightly forward, pretending not to. Servers exchanged quiet glances, silently hoping she would handle what was coming next as she always did. And at the table, the man in the suit sat back, confident in his perceived control, ready to continue testing her patience. He picked up his fork and knife, speaking again in Spanish, his words sharper now, more pointed. He commented on the arrangement of the plate, the way the vegetables were cut, the angle at which the meat was cooked. Each comment was meant to be both a critique and a challenge. His tone had an edge of arrogance, a belief that he could provoke, intimidate, and ultimately dominate the situation. He was confident that she would fumble, that she would betray a hint of frustration or unease. The waitress approached again, holding the tray carefully. She set the plates down with precision, maintaining a polite smile. Her movements were fluid, calm, and deliberate. She listened to his comments patiently, nodding slightly, giving the impression that she was absorbing his words. Her outward calm, however, did not reflect passivity. Every word he spoke, she understood completely, cataloged and held in mind. Every subtle insult, every intended provocation, she recognized, but she chose silence. This silence was intentional. It was her shield, her way of letting him overextend himself without giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. He continued speaking, now in a faster rhythm, try to throw her off balance. He made small jokes at her expense, all in Spanish, assuming she could not understand. He laughed quietly at his own remarks, looking around to see if anyone else noticed. A few diners did notice, and some quietly recognized the insults. There was a murmur, almost imperceptible, passing to the restaurant like a soft wave. People began to sense that this interaction was not ordinary. They did not yet know what would happen, but they understood something important was unfolding. She remained unshaken. Her eyes met his briefly, and in that small exchange, there was calm awareness. She had learned long ago that power often came not from words, but from control over one's own responses. She maintained her composure, letting the man speak, letting the tension build, while quietly preparing herself for the moment when she would respond. Timing, she knew, was everything. The man, confident that his verbal barbs were invisible to her, continued escalating. He criticized her manner of walking back to the kitchen, the way she placed napkins on the table, even the sound of her footsteps. Each remark carried subtle derision. He leaned back in his chair, watching, expecting her to falter, but she did not. She continued her service calmly, noting each word, each gesture, each attempt to provoke. Other customers who understood Spanish began to lean in more noticeably, quietly observing. Their eyes were fixed, their conversations lowered to whispers. Some nudged their companions, pointing discreetly, sharing a subtle awareness of the tension. The restaurant staff remained professional, but their glances toward her were filled with concern and admiration. They had seen arrogance before, but rarely in combination with such precise patience. She was absorbing every challenge, every attempt at disrespect, and turning it into quiet control. The man paused, giving a short, sharp laugh at what he assumed was his dominance. His eyes flicked to the waitress, as if expecting some sign of discomfort. But there was none. Her calmness was absolute. Her smile remained polite, her voice unshaken. She made small clarifications about the order in English, still maintaining perfect service. This alone was enough to slightly unsettle him. Confidence is often shaken when the expected reaction fails to appear, and he could feel it, even if he did not fully acknowledge it. He leaned forward, speaking faster now, words flowing in Spanish with deliberate intent. He commented on the restaurant, the staff, even the diners. Each comment was designed to be sharp, to provoke laughter or embarrassment, to show that he was in control. The room around him, quiet as it was, seemed to pause with each word. Other diners pretended to continue their meals, but their attention was drawn subtly, impossible to ignore. There was a collective sense of anticipation, though few could articulate exactly why. Finally, the waitress returned to the table after bringing condiments and refills. She placed everything carefully, maintaining her calm demeanor. She looked at him directly, paused for a moment, and spoke. But she did not immediately reply in English. Instead, she spoke in clear, fluent Spanish. Her voice was calm, measured, and confident. She repeated portions of what it said, acknowledging his words, correcting minor errors in his assumptions, and addressing the subtle insults he had directed at her. But she did it without anger, without malice, with a quiet precision that left no room for him to dominate the conversation. The effect on the room was immediate. Diners who understood Spanish stopped mid-bite, their eyes widening. Even those who did not understand the language could sense the shift in energy. There was an invisible change in power, subtle but unmistakable. The man leaned back, shocked, his smirk faltering for the first time. He had assumed ignorance. He had assumed submission. But what he encountered instead was awareness, skill, and dignity. She continued speaking in Spanish, calmly addressing every attempt to belittle her. She did not raise her voice. She did not mock him. She simply exposed with quiet clarity that she had understood everything from beginning. The arrogance he carried as a shield was now reflected back at him, neutralized by calm and quiet authority. The silence in the restaurant was thick, not awkward, but full of anticipation and recognition. People were witnessing more than a customer interaction. They were witnessing someone command respect without confrontation, simply through composure and skill. The man's reaction was a mixture of surprise and unease. His usual tools, intimidation, language, assumed superiority, were ineffective here. He could feel the shift in the room, the eyes on him, the quiet judgment of those who had been watching. And yet, he could not immediately recover. His words faltered, his gestures slowed, and his confident facade began to crumble just slightly. The waitress, aware of every subtle change, maintained her calm. She answered his questions politely, corrected misperceptions gently, and ensured the service remained flawless. Every interaction reinforced that she was fully in control of herself and, indirectly, of the situation. Her composure became a shield that made his words powerless. She had turned his own test into her demonstration of strength. And the restaurant, previously just a backdrop for a meal, had now become a stage for an unspoken confrontation. Other diners shifted in their seats, some exchanging looks that conveyed admiration and surprise. The staff, watching closely, felt a mix of relief and awe. They had seen her handle difficult customers before, but never with such total control over every element. Over the room, over the tension, over the energy of a situation. Even without raising her voice or confronting him angrily, she had effectively changed the dynamic. The man, realizing his usual tactics were failing, tried one more subtle maneuver. He spoke quietly, almost conversationally, in Spanish, tried to regain his composure and assert his dominance. But the waitress remained undisturbed. She replied just as calmly, politely, and with clear awareness. Each word she spoke demonstrated knowledge, skill, and confidence. Her silence earlier had been deliberate. Her response now was precise. Carefully measured conveyed both understanding and quiet authority. The shift was complete. The atmosphere in the restaurant had changed. The man, who had entered assuming control, now found himself facing someone he could not dominate. The power of calm, understanding, and patient composure had transformed the situation. Diners continued to watch subtly, their attention drawn to the dynamic unfolding at that corner table. The restaurant, once just a place of ordinary meals, now held a story within its walls, a story of patience, intelligence, and quiet strength. The waitress stepped back after finishing the service, her posture steady, her expression calm. The The man remained seated, his usual confidence shaken, though he tried not to show it. For everyone else it was clear. A balance had shifted, and respect had been quietly earned without anger, without confrontation, simply through awareness, patience, and composure. In that moment, the restaurant was more than a place for dinner. It had become a stage for dignity and quiet victory. And she, standing there with the same polite smile and steady hands, had proven something far more lasting than any words could convey. The restaurant remained quiet for a moment longer after a calm response in Spanish. The usual background noise, the clatter of dishes, the soft hum of conversation, the gentle music, had not fully returned. It was as if the entire room had paused, holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. People at nearby tables subtly shifted in their seats, watching her and the man, sensing the invisible shift in power that had just taken place. The man leaned back in his chair, tried to regain composure. He cleared his throat, glanced at the menu as if it could provide him with an escape, and took a small sip of water. His confidence had been shaken, though he tried to hide it. There was a subtle tension in his shoulders now, a quiet admission that he had misjudged the situation. The polite smirk that had once defined his arrogance had vanished, replaced by a faint uncertainty. It was clear to anyone watching that the balance in the interaction had changed, and he knew it. Other diners began to exchange whispers. Some spoke in Spanish, confirming what had been said, and others simply looked at one another, wide-eyed, impressed by what they had witnessed. A couple nearby leaned slightly toward each other, speaking in hushed tones. She understood every word. One said quietly, and she answered perfectly, without anger. Their voices carried admiration, not just for her skill, but for the way she had handled the situation with quiet dignity. People started noticing that respect does not always come from confrontation. It can come from composure, confidence, and awareness. The staff had been watching closely, and now a few let out small sighs of relief. They knew she had handled a potentially volatile situation with perfect professionalism. The manager, who had been overseeing the floor from a distance, finally approached discreetly. He leaned slightly toward another server and whispered, "She's handling this better than I could have imagined." The servers nodded, their eyes still on the table, realizing that this moment was far from ordinary. They were witnessing someone command respect without raising a voice or becoming confrontational. The man tried to speak again, lowering his tone and choosing his words carefully. His Spanish was slower now, less sharp, almost measured, as if he were testing a different approach. He asked questions about the food, attempting to shift the focus to the meal itself, hoping perhaps that the previous moment could be forgotten, but the atmosphere had already changed. His attempt at regaining authority were faint against the quiet strength she had shown. Every word she had spoken had been heard and understood, and the subtle power shift was now permanent. The waitress approached the table again, placing condiments neatly and adjusting a small detail of his plate at his subtle request. She remained composed, her expression steady, her voice polite. She answered the questions calmly, clearly, and completely. There was no hint of defensiveness, no tremor of uncertainty, and no rush to justify herself. In that simple, natural way, she maintained control of the interaction. She did not need to dominate the conversation with anger or loud words. Her presence alone had shifted the room. The man's posture slowly changed. He leaned slightly forward, resting his elbows on the table, a small acknowledgement of defeat forming in the set of his shoulders. His usual energy of arrogance had dissipated, replaced by the quiet, subtle realization that he could no longer assert control. He was aware now that the people around the table had seen everything. He could feel the judgment of the room, even if no one said a word directly to him. Respect, he realized, was not something commanded through wealth, tone, or perceived superiority. It was earned, and he had failed to earn it here. Other diners began to quietly resume their meals, but the energy of the room remained charged. Conversations were slower, more attentive. People stole glances at the table, recognizing that something rare had occurred. The young couple at the window leaned closer together, whispering softly. The family celebrating nearby exchanged quiet looks. Even those who did not understand Spanish could feel the weight of what had happened. There was an unspoken lesson in the air. Arrogance and disrespect may demand attention, but quiet confidence and skill command lasting admiration. The manager approached once more, this time closer to the table. He watched for a moment, then stepped back without interrupting. There was no need. The situation was under control. The waitress had handled everything herself, with grace and professionalism. He simply made a mental note to ensure she was recognized later for how calmly she had managed a potentially embarrassing situation. This was a moment not just of service, but of quiet leadership, and he was aware that she had earned it. The man shifted in his seat again, now quieter, less sure. He tried a small smile, a minimal attempt at reconciliation or politeness, but it felt strained. There was no sudden apology, no loud admission of defeat, just a subtle acknowledgement that he had miscalculated. He realized that in this restaurant, in this interaction, his words no longer carried weight. The respect he had expected to demand from fear or arrogance was gone. Instead, it had been replaced by a recognition of quiet strength, strength he could neither challenge nor ignore. The waitress, still calm, glanced briefly at the diners nearby, offering a gentle smile as she returned to the kitchen. Her movements were careful, deliberate, but effortless. She did not gloat. She did not seek attention. She simply continued her work, aware that her actions had spoken louder than any argument could. Behind her quiet demeanor was a deep awareness. She had maintained control, protected her dignity, and commanded respect without raising her voice. The entire restaurant had witnessed it, even if many could not put it into words. Near the back of the dining area, servers quietly whispered among themselves. "I can't believe she stayed so calm," one said softly. Another nodded. She handled him without losing her composure once. That's rare. There was admiration in their tone and a subtle sense of pride. In their world, difficult customers were part of the job, but moments like this, where professionalism, calm, and quiet intelligence overtook arrogance, were exceptional. They watched as she moved through the room, steady and focused, her presence commanding respect without a word. The man, now seated with plate mostly untouched, seemed lost in thought. He adjusted his napkin, glanced at the menu again, and finally lowered his eyes. There was no loud confrontation, no argument, no attempt to reclaim dominance through words. The interaction had ended not with display of anger, but with subtle acknowledgement. He had been bested in a quiet, human way. He had assumed superiority based on wealth and tone, only to find that respect cannot be bought, demanded, or feigned. It must be earned, and she had earned it. The restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations resumed, laughter trickled back into the corners, and the soft clatter of dishes became familiar once more. But near that one table, the energy remained different. The diners who had watched closely carried a sense of awe, a quiet understanding that they had just witnessed something unusual. It was a reminder that strength is not always loud, and that dignity often comes in quiet, controlled moments rather than through confrontation. The waitress continued her work with the same steady rhythm as before. She refilled drinks, collected empty plates, and moved between tables without pause. To anyone who did not notice what had occurred, she simply appeared as a skilled, professional server performing her job. But those who had witnessed the exchange knew the truth. She had faced a challenge that could have unsettled anyone, and she had handled it with calm intelligence and unwavering self-respect. Back at the table, the man finally set down his utensils. His plate was barely touched, but it no longer mattered. He had learned a lesson, subtle and humbling. Words, arrogance, and assumed superiority could not overpower patience, understanding, and quiet composure. The power dynamic had shifted, and the restaurant had seen it unfold without anyone needing to raise their voice. Respect had been earned in the most human way possible, through poise, awareness, and calm action. The evening continued, the lights soft, the music gentle, and the restaurant returning to its normal pace. Yet the moment lingered in the air, a story quietly witnessed by all who had been present. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful interactions are not the loudest, but the ones where dignity and awareness quietly prevail. And she, moving through the room with grace, had ensured that everyone watching would remember the lesson long after plates were cleared and the chairs were pushed back into place. The restaurant slowly settled back into its usual rhythm, but something had shifted that no one could ignore. The evening continued. Diners finished their meals, and servers moved efficiently between tables. Yet near that corner, the energy had changed. The man in the suit, once so confident, now sat quietly, occasionally glancing around, aware that everyone who had been watching knew the truth. His arrogance had been replaced by a quiet humility, or at least the beginnings of it. And he understood, even if he didn't fully admit it, that he had misjudged the young waitress in front of him. She moved calmly between tables, taking orders, refilling glasses, clearing plates, and offering smiles to customers. She did not act triumphant. She did not draw attention to herself. Yet everyone who had seen the interaction knew the truth. She had stood her ground without raising her voice, without confrontation, and without letting anger guide her actions. Her quiet strength had been more powerful than any loud argument could have been. It had left an impression on everyone, a story embedded in the evening, unspoken but understood. The man finally set his utensils down and straightened in his chair. He did not speak, not at first. There was no dramatic apology, no loud concession. He simply observed, processing the shift in his own way. It was subtle but significant. He had entered the restaurant expecting to command control through his tone and status. He had assumed he could intimidate and provoke without consequence. And now he realized that control is not given by position, wealth, or arrogance. Respect is earned, sometimes quietly, through skill, awareness, and composure. She had earned it. Around the room, diners continued their meals, but the moment lingered. Some exchanged small, knowing smiles. Others whispered softly to companions, recounting what had happened in their own words. A few had understood the Spanish. Others had sensed the tension and the shift in energy. All of them recognized that they had just witnessed something rare, a display of human dignity and quiet strength that transcended language and circumstance. The restaurant itself seemed to breathe differently, as if acknowledging the lesson that had unfolded in its walls. The staff, having watched from behind counters and between tables, now spoke in low tones. One server quietly said, "I've never seen anyone handle that situation like that." Another nodded, whispering. Not only did she handle it, she owned it without even trying. Their admiration was genuine. They understood that her actions were not about proving herself. They were about maintaining dignity and composure in the face of arrogance. She had set an example that would stay with them long after the shift ended. The manager, who had observed the entire exchange from a discreet distance, finally approached her when the table had quieted. His expression was one of quiet pride. "You handled that perfectly," he said softly. "I don't think anyone could have done it better." She nodded politely, her smile calm and natural. She did not dwell on praise, nor did she need it. She knew what had happened, and that was enough. The recognition was implicit in the respect she had earned from everyone present, from diners to staff alike. The man eventually rose from his chair, signaling for his check. He did not speak much, offering a quiet nod to the waitress, an acknowledgement that was more meaningful than any words. There was no dramatic flourish, no attempt to regain lost pride. The humility, subtle though it was there in his posture and the careful attention he gave as he left the table. The restaurant watched quietly as he exited, leaving behind a sense of closure, a story complete in the eyes of all who had witnessed it. As the door closed behind him, the atmosphere gradually returned to normal. Conversations grew louder, laughter returned to tables, and the soft music once again became the background to ordinary dining. Yet the moment lingered in the minds of those who had been paying attention. It was a reminder that strength does not always manifest in confrontation. Sometimes it is shown quietly, through awareness, calm, and composed action. The waitress had proven this truth in the most human way possible. With dignity, patience, and unwavering composure, she continued her work, moving efficiently from table to table, her steps steady, her expressions calm. To anyone arriving late or unaware, she appeared simply as a competent, skilled server. But to those who had witnessed her interaction with the man in the suit, she was more than that. She was an example of quiet power, a demonstration that respect is earned not through loud words or displays of status, but through control over oneself and the way one responds to challenges. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the energy in the restaurant had changed. Diners who had been present at that corner table carried with them a subtle sense of inspiration. They spoke quietly among themselves about what had happened, about how composure and understanding could outweigh arrogance. They recognized that respect cannot be demanded or assumed. It must be earned through consistent, human-centered behavior. And she, in her calm, understated way, had done exactly that. By the end of the shift, she had handled countless other tables, each interaction professional and smooth. She moved through the room with a quiet confidence that left a lasting impression. The staff, inspired and quietly proud, knew they had witnessed something exceptional. And for the diners who had seen it unfold, the story would remain with them, a quiet reminder that human dignity and composure can transform even the most uncomfortable situations. As she cleaned the last table of the evening, stacking chairs and wiping surfaces, she allowed herself a small, private smile. The challenge had been met. The lesson had been delivered. The night had continued, and yet the impact of the moment would not fade easily. It was more than a memory of a rude customer or a difficult interaction. It was proof that respect, humility, and quiet strength are qualities that shine through in the most ordinary moments and leave the deepest impression. She gathered her things, preparing to leave the night, her steps calm and unhurried. The restaurant behind her was slowly emptying, staff exchanging quiet words and smiles as they finished their shifts. She walked out into the evening with the same quiet dignity that had guided her throughout the entire interaction. The streets were busy with life, but the lesson she had demonstrated would remain quietly powerful for everyone who had witnessed it. In that night, under the glow of streetlights and the soft hum of the city, she reflected briefly on what had occurred. No loud victory had been declared. No dramatic confrontation had taken place. Yet she had won something far more lasting. Respect. Not the respect that comes from fear, wealth, or status, but the kind that comes from composure, intelligence, and the ability to stand firm in one's dignity. It was a victory of human-centered strength, subtle, quiet, and undeniable. And in that moment, she knew that her actions, simple, composed, and completely human, had changed something, not just the man who had tested her, but for everyone who had witnessed the story unfold. Respect had been quietly earned. Confidence had been quietly displayed, and the restaurant, filled with ordinary moments, had become the stage for an extraordinary lesson about patience, composure, and the quiet power of dignity.